Hello students. Today we will be discussing the topic exploring new strands of intellectualism, traditions of Islamic historiography. Now India's contact with the Islamic world began quite early, much before the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate in the 13th century. It would therefore be fruitful to take a look at early Islamic intellectualism, especially Islamic ideas on history, as these were to impact Indian society and culture in a major way in the centuries to come. Now, the approach of Islamic historical ideas was in some ways rooted in early intellectual orientations in the Arabian Peninsula. These thoughts had existed in pre-Islamic times. The historian K.R. Kanungo writes that pre-Islamic Arabia was a mere geographical expression. It had never existed as an independent state, nor did it have a political entity that could transform the region into a viable principality or a stable kingdom. This was an era that was primal and confused. It was identified as Jahili in Quranic wisdom. However, about a couple of centuries before the advent of Islam, that is, during the period of Jahili, which actually means disorder and disorganization, Arabia had achieved linguistic unity. There was a shift in political and economic power towards the north. Towns like Mecca, Yathrib, later Medina and Hira flourished economically. By contrast, the south was beset by disturbances. The aggressive proselytizing of Christianity and Judaism sapped it of its vitality. Certain cultural patterns became prominent in the northern arc, also known as Arabia Ferox. The North Arabic language and script attained a new mastery and prevailed almost over the entire Arabic space, overshadowing the culture of the south or Arabia Felix. Now, the cultural domination of the north evolved from local inspiration. Two things were prized during this period. One was the art of war, and the other was eloquence. So, there existed now a rich corpus of poetry in different genres like epic, tragic, or ironic. So, poetry was the principal idiom through which the literate Arab expressed himself. Now, this poetry revealed Arab achievements and embodied the cultural heritage of the times. It looked back at a past without consciously seeking to do so. Lyrical biographies of poets and commentaries on literary anthologies brought out a sort of indistinct historical perceptibility. Now, in general, Jahili poets composed lyrics on the lives of poets, wandering princes, and noble warriors. Martial pride and stories of tribes were recurrent themes here. Now, these literary offerings of the Jahili poets inspired on a subconscious plane societal norms, codes of conduct, and an ethical system through which a positive historicity was reflected. The Islamic conception of history drew strength from this. Later, Muslim historiography was also indebted to Jahili poet in the respect of form and structure as well as mode of transmission. The Qasida as the form of projecting news was introduced now. Now this entire piece rested on isnad, that is, a transmission change. Reporters or rawiya played a pivotal role in transmission, that is isnad, of khabar, that is report, constituting the essence or matan. Thus, the Jahili rawiya had the responsibility of presenting authentic news. And this formed an integral part of the poet's observations of society and life around him. The precursor of the Muslim historian could thus be identified here. Now let us look at traditions of Muslim historiography. The Islamic sense of history evolved through the Quran, the Hadith, and through secular writings or adab. Now dimensions of history resting on time and space were integral to the Quran and its vision of history. In fact, from the very outset, the Quran was synonymous with historical vision or thought. So, history was immediately cognizant to God. The Almighty is the ultimate moderator in the ongoing plot of history in which the past, present, and the future merge. The fundamental tools of recalling the past were the Quranic Qissa and Qasa. The former was essentially more of a report of an event rather than a tale. It was primarily through the Qasas that historical events were depicted. Second to the Quran, the Hadith was axial to the development of history as a discipline. The Hadith matured through the recording of religious and historical involvements in the first 1.5 centuries after the inception of Islam. The text depended on a chain of transmitters, isnad, who supplied khabar, news, and naba, information, in their particular ilm, that is vocabulary. Now these hadith had multiple content. It included religious matter, legal injunctions, rituals, stories of tribes, ethical conduct, and biographical snippets. Sometimes there were different versions, and they conflicted often with each other. The advancement of the hadith as a quasi-historical discourse occurred alongside political developments such as the early Muslim conquests, civil wars, and socio-economic upheavals between 656 and 692 AH. Now, this textual evolution matured even more as discussions veered away from the tumultuous times of conquest and resistance, that is known as fitan, and dwelt on a period of comparative stability when wars had been won and rising Islamic states had established themselves. With time, the hadith transformed itself into an official archive. It changed from a short descriptive piece, shahifa or parchment, into a kitab or a book. Now, the written form of the hadith was encouraged by the Umayyads, and they gradually delineated a standard historical consciousness. It elaborated on a legitimate past instead of discussing an uncertain future. Muhammad ibn Ishaq, 761, played a seminal role in the transition of the hadith to history. Now let us look at the third category, adab ou belles lettres. A more secular orientation in historical perspective emerged around the 9th century with the adab ou belles lettres. Now, initially, the adab stood for education, but later represented the moral and intellectual aspirations of the educated urban sections of society. So, adab displayed elegant writing in prose and was motivated by complex political and cultural aspirations. With the rise of the Umayyads and later the Abbasids, the need was felt to propagate the superiority of these empires among the tribes of the region that had been used to dynastic rule. So a new rhetoric was launched, overshadowing earlier political mores as well as cultural symbols. And this alternative political narrative was formulated by bureaucrats, like state secretaries, who sought to influence and transform. Legacy of historiography, of Islamic historiography, remained extremely profound in medieval India. The importance of history that was ingrained in the Quran encouraged its study by the Arabs under the Umayyads and the Abbasid Caliphate. History writing was also triggered by the commencement of a common chronology from 622, which marked the Hijra, or the migration of the Prophet from Mecca to Medina. Empire building too, at the time of Fitan, Mahalim, etc., which meant upheaval and resistance, encouraged the writing of comprehensive world history. Later, the Arabs imbibed a lot from pre-Islamic Sassanid Persia, which had a very strong historiographical tradition. Subsequently, the Persians produced wonderful works and presented histories that abounded in literary beauty. Now, biographies were the first works of import in the trajectory of early Islamic intellectuality. The idea that history was a record of events and the activities of humankind in general was invoked. So, early historical narratives centered on persons connected with the events themselves, and the idea of space, that is, universal versus regional. The Sirah, or biographies of the Prophet, acquired great prominence, though some modern historians are rather skeptical about their utility as historical sources. Now, material on the life of the Prophet had throughout this time systematically been collected. Historical genres came to be grouped into sacred history, tribal history, tales of battles, and world history. The Sirah, as I said, which meant biography, Maghazi, sacred history, Ayam and Futu, battle and conquest, Ansab, genealogy, and Qissas al-Anbiya, tales of prophets, represented these different segments. Tribal lore, ballads, sagas, genealogies, which had the historical value of recording feats of leaders in intertribal conflict, existed as parallel records of the past. Genealogy was the next important category, which can be regarded as a quasi-historical work. So the Nasab or Ansab, which is genealogy, was an intellectual preoccupation embedded in Arabian tribal tradition. Genealogy was extremely important in pinpointing the individual's place vis-a-vis the collective, especially where the tribe functioned as the most important socio-political unit. The relationship between different tribes too was extremely contextual in this political framework which we see during these times. Later, this genre was taken up by Arab scholars as an independent field of social science. In a sense, the environment melded together with the identification of the collective entity and lines of heritage, and thus provided a perfect stimulus for historical thought. All this was later collated with Quranic ideas of history, leading to the formation of new paradigms of intellectual inquiry. Now let us look at different styles in India. Now, historiographical works were plentiful in the pre-Sultanate and the Sultanate era. The historians in medieval India, later under the Turkish rule, were more inclined towards the Persian style of historical narration. The Arab rendition of history, which had peaked in the 10th century, gradually diminished in the face of the overpowering strains of the Persian Renaissance. In medieval India, Muslim historians distanced themselves somewhat from indigenous narrative fashions. They superimposed their own techniques according to Persian and Arabic writing sensibilities. The Ghaznavides were steeped in Persian culture and designed their own histories accordingly. The Turks, who invaded and subsequently settled in India, were also ardent enthusiasts of the elegant traits of Persian civilization. It was this Persian refinement and elitism that remained a significant influence on Indo-Muslim scholars. Moving forward into the medieval period, Minhaj-uz-Siraj and Hasan Nizami represent Persian stylization, though a perceptible shift may be noted in the work of Ziauddin Barani. Muzaffar Alam stresses that there was a very significant use of the Persian language in political and cultural conversation in the new Indo-Islamic epoch in India. Two kinds of disquisitions, like the Adab and Akhlaq, brought in broadened perspectives on legal and political questions. In the context of political and legal questions, the Adab was close to the Perso-Iranian traditions, while the Akhlaq was more eclectic and imbibed non-Islamic thought to a large extent. This sort of diverse political literature helped position Persian as a language of choice among the elite intellectuals of the subcontinent. Let us look at three more genres of history writing in medieval India. They begin from the early medieval and proceed to medieval India. So there were political chronicles, the Insha, and the Tazkira. Now, political chronicles were written principally as celebratory offerings to monarchs and patrons. Right? They constituted the first of the prolific literature of the Sultanate period. Now, K.A. Nizami warns that their validity as historical texts should be subject to searching examination. The political affiliation of the author, his background, his motives, and his information gathering mechanism should be scrutinized, because there could be exaggerations about the victor and descriptions of total annihilation of the vanquished in these works. They should be authenticated from another source. Two other genres, Insha literature and Tazkira literature, assumed importance in medieval India. Now, the epistle or Insha had a multidimensional functionality. It was a wonderful medium of expressing one's literary talent in the medieval world. Collections of letters had immense value, as they normally contained information that could not be found in other sources. Zinat-ul-Kutab of Abul Fazl Baihaqi, 1077, was one of the earliest Persian Insha traditions. Bahauddin Baghdadi's collection of letters from 1182 to 84 were compiled in the Introduction to the Art of Letter Writing, and these included numerous interesting documents. So these two scholars were abiding inspirations to medieval Indian Insha writers. Moving on to a later era, that is to the Sultanate period once again, the Insha of Amir Khusru, Ijaz-e Khusravi, had a pioneering role in India in the sense that it contained immense information on contemporary society and culture written in Khusru's peerless literary style. The Insha-i Maru of Ainul Mulk, Multani, was a different category altogether because it contained and sent a number of documents on which provided information on the Tughlaq administration. Further south, Mahmud Gawan composed Riyaz-ul-Insha, which gave us prolific glimpses into the politics and society of the southern part of the subcontinent. Now to Tazkira literature. Tazkira literature constituted another important classification, though it was really the 17th century which saw the high point of this genre. Chiefly accounts of poets, they also revolved around the lives of ulema, Sufis, and other literary persona. Positing a sense of the prevalent intellectual atmosphere, they often contained invaluable historical pointers about society at large. One of the earliest tazkiras was the Lubab-ul-Albab, compiled by Aufi in 1221. This was dedicated to the Wazir of Kubacha. Now, we can talk about another category which is known as sacred literature. Right? So, before that, actually, we will have to discuss Masnavi. So the Masnavi, the mystic literature, and Qasidas comprise another gamut of literature in medieval India. So a number of other literary forms evolved from early Islamic intellectualism. Masnavis, as well as mystic literature, added to the dynamism of the literary atmosphere of medieval India. A narrative in verse on a particular subject, the Masnavi had two categories, historical and romantic. Amir Khusru was famous for his historical versified storytelling. He composed Kiran-us-Sadain and Miftah-ul-Futu. Though the poet could elaborate on selected sub-themes, these were essentially bound by historical data. Qasidas, or the Persian poetic form, was emulated in India. We have spoken about Qasidas before. At that time, they were actually more related to news and reporting. But now, Persian Qasidas evolved as a poetic form and it was emulated in India. These Qasidas contained much imagination and overt exaggeration. Nevertheless, they did supply certain historical data of value and were not totally redundant as sources. Though the poet did try to gratify his patron, there was scope for learning about the diverse interests of the medieval monarch. The tradition of penning Qasidas was strongly entrenched in proto-Islamic intellectuality. Mysticism, which permeated the Indian religious scenario alongside Islam in its institutional form, generated its particular type of literary creations. To authors who had immersed themselves completely in spiritualism, service to humankind remained the overarching ideal that they strove for. Hence, the writings of these saints, pervaded with alternate perspectives and focused on those deeds of the political authority that aimed at common good. As such, they provided refreshingly novel views on political and social acts, so crucial for objective historical analysis. Malfuzat, or conversation of saints, Maktubat, or the collection of letters, and biographies of saints, as well as litanies on mystic thought, constituted the gamut of saintly literature. So important segments of medieval society found a place in such literature. Also, the extent of mysticism that permeated India, as well as questions of how much of a shift from the original ideologies had taken place, could be assessed from them. So, we end our lecture on early Islamic intellectualism and Islamic historical ideas here. We will continue with the second segment in another lecture, which is to follow soon. Thank you.